A gray morning in Seoul seemed to perfectly reflect Jiyoung's state of mind. Her small apartment was a mess, with piles of unpaid bills on the table and clothes scattered across the floor. She finished tying her hair into a hurried bun, grabbed her bag, and dashed out the door. On her way, the incessant buzzing of her phone reminded her of the creditors who refused to give up. The subway was crowded, and she barely managed to squeeze in before the doors closed. Her heart raced as she mentally organized her next steps. The job interview she had that morning was her last chance to secure a temporary secretary position at Kang Group, Seoul's largest technology company. Jiyoung knew she wasn't the most qualified candidate, but she desperately needed the paycheck. When she arrived at the imposing Kang Group building, she couldn't help but feel a pang of nervousness. The lobby was grand, with gleaming marble floors and impeccably dressed employees. Jiyoung adjusted the hem of her worn skirt, trying to appear confident. But fate seemed to enjoy playing tricks on her. As she approached the reception desk, she realized she had forgotten her folder with her documents. Panic spread across her face, but before she could think about going back, a cold voice interrupted her. "Are you planning to stand there all day?" She turned and came face to face with Minseok Kang. Tall, impeccably dressed in a sharp black suit, he stared at her like she was a problem that needed solving immediately. He held a coffee cup, now half empty, as part of the liquid had spilled onto the floor. I'm so sorry," Jiyoung stammered, realizing that in the chaos of her arrival, she had bumped into him. Minseok didn't respond immediately. His eyes assessed the young woman before him, clearly nervous but not backing down. He sighed, handing his cup to the nearest security guard. "I don't have time to deal with this right now." He turned and walked away, leaving Jiyoung frozen for a few seconds. She turned to the receptionist, who seemed to share Minseok's intimidating aura. "Name?" the woman asked emotionlessly. "Kim Jiyoung. I'm here for the temporary secretary interview." The receptionist merely pointed to an elevator without saying another word. Taking a deep breath, Jiyoung entered the elevator, still feeling Minseok's gaze lingering in her mind. In the interview room, Jiyoung did her best. Her answers were direct, and she managed to mask her lack of experience with determination. When she left the room, her heart was heavy with uncertainty, but something inside her told her that the day was far from over. Hours later, as she walked home with her shoes pinching her feet, her phone rang. "Miss Kim Jiyoung?" "Yes, this is she." "This is Kang Group. Congratulations, you've been selected for the position. Your orientation starts tomorrow at 9 a.m. Jiyoung stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. For a moment, the weight on her shoulders seemed to lighten. She finally had a path to escape her debts. The next morning, Jiyoung arrived promptly at Kang Group's headquarters. Despite her simple outfit, which she had carefully cleaned and pressed, she felt out of place among the impeccably dressed employees. Still, she held her head high as she followed the instructions she had been given the previous day. When she entered the office reserved for the CEO's secretary, she was greeted by an older woman with a stern expression and glasses that seemed to scrutinize her every move. "I'm Director Park, head of human resources. Your job will be simple. Organize the CEO's schedule, respond to his requests, and avoid asking unnecessary questions. Mr. Kang values efficiency and discretion." Jiyoung nodded nervously, but the woman continued with an almost condescending smile. "Don't worry. If you can't handle the pressure, we usually figure that out within the first week." The comment felt more like a challenge. Determined, Jiyoung simply thanked her and took her place at the desk. Her first task was to organize a pile of emails and reports that had been left in disarray. As she focused on her work, she heard firm footsteps coming down the hallway. Before she could look up, the door opened, revealing Minseok Kang. He walked past her without so much as a glance, heading straight for his office. His presence dominated the room, and Jiyoung felt a chill run down her spine. "Miss Kim," he said, finally turning to look at her. "I want the last quarter's report on my desk in 15 minutes. "Yes, Mr. Kang," she replied quickly, scrambling to locate the files on her computer. The first few days were like this. Direct orders, icy stares, and zero room for mistakes. Jiyoung began to wonder if she could withstand the intensity of the environment. On Friday, as Jiyoung adjusted Minseok's schedule, something unexpected happened. A man entered the office without announcing himself, bringing a completely different energy than Minseok's. He was dressed casually, with an easygoing smile on his face. "You must be the new secretary," he said before introducing himself. Joon Kang, the boss's younger brother. Jiyoung was surprised by his friendly and relaxed tone. Joon was the complete opposite of Minseok. Where the CEO exuded authority, Joon was laid back, almost charming. He leaned over Ji-young's desk, curious. "So, how's it going working for him?" "Pretty scary, huh?" Ji-young tried to smile but hesitated to answer. Joon noticed and laughed. "Oh, don't worry. He's not that bad. He just seems like it." Before they could continue, the office door opened again. Minseok stepped out, frowning at the sight of his brother. "What are you doing here, Joon?" "Just meeting the new secretary." Minseok narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious, but said nothing. He returned to his office, leaving the atmosphere tense. Jiyoung couldn't help but notice the strange dynamic between the two brothers. There was something unspoken but heavy in the air. Days later, Jiyoung was asked to accompany Minseok on a business trip to a resort outside Seoul. It was an important event to close a deal with international investors. She spent the entire week preparing documents and schedules to ensure everything went smoothly. At the resort, Jiyoung barely had time to breathe. Minseok was constantly on the move, discussing strategies, while she rushed to deliver the necessary materials. Even so, the environment was slightly more relaxed than usual, and for the first time, she saw a different side of Minseok. After the formal dinner with the investors, Jiyoung took a walk through the resort's garden, trying to unwind after a long day. That's when she ran into Joon, who was also staying at the resort. He seemed completely at ease, holding a glass of wine. "You should relax more. This place is amazing," he said, inviting her to sit on a bench. They talked for a while, and Jiyoung began to feel comfortable around him. Joon was charismatic and asked questions about her life in a way that felt genuine. When she finally retired to rest, she didn't notice the enigmatic smile Joon wore as he watched her leave, as though he had already made a plan. The next morning, while reviewing the papers before the final meeting, Jiyoung overheard an argument in the hallway. She discreetly approached and recognized the voices of Minseok and Joon. "Stop using people as if they're pawns in your game," Minseok said, his voice low but filled with anger. "You always think you're in control of everything," Joon retorted, his tone defiant. "Let's see how long that lasts." Jiyoung quickly returned to her desk, trying to process what she had overheard. Something about the conversation made her heart race, an unsettling feeling that she was becoming entangled in something far bigger than she realized. After returning from the business trip, Jiyoung tried to reorganize her thoughts. Despite the chaos at work, her interactions with Joon had left an impression. He was charming and attentive, the kind of person who seemed to care. Unlike Minseok, who was always distant and authoritarian. Still, she couldn't forget the tense argument between the brothers at the resort. Back at the office, Jiyoung focused on her tasks. Throughout the week, Joon started appearing more often, always finding excuses to talk to her. His words were kind, and he asked questions that made her feel seen, something she wasn't used to. Gradually, Jiyoung began to trust him, despite the subtle warnings from other employees who mentioned that Joon wasn't always what he seemed. "Don't believe everything they say," Joon said one day, noticing her hesitation. "I think I've earned a reputation as a troublemaker just because I'm freer than my brother." Jiyoung gave a shy smile but didn't respond. She knew Minseok disapproved of these interactions. Whenever he saw them together, he cast critical looks but said nothing. One evening, while finishing up paperwork, Joon unexpectedly appeared at her desk with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "You've been working so hard. Come on, just 1 glass to relax." Jiyoung tried to refuse, but Joon insisted, saying it was a gesture of gratitude for all her hard work. She relented, and the conversation flowed easily. Joon was charming, and for a brief moment, Jiyoung felt she could let her guard down. Later that night, Jiyoung began to feel strange, as if she were dizzy. Joon helped her get home, insisting she wasn't well. She could barely remember what happened after she got into the taxi with him. The next morning, Jiyoung woke up with a sense of unease. Fragmented memories of the previous night swirled in her mind. Joon had been kind, but something didn't feel right. Trying to push aside the discomfort, she focused on her work. Weeks later, Jiyoung started feeling sick, with morning nausea and excessive fatigue. Initially, she thought it was stress, but when the symptoms persisted, she decided to buy a pregnancy test. The positive result left her in shock. Alone in her small apartment, she stared at the test, her hands trembling. Fear and confusion consumed her. She thought of Jun, who had been growing closer to her, and recalled the night he had taken her home. Determined to get clarity, Jiyoung asked to meet Jun after work. In a discreet cafe, she revealed the news, unsure of what to expect. "I'm pregnant," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Jun seemed surprised, but quickly composed himself. "Jiyoung, I'll take care of you. Don't worry, we'll get through this together." Despite his reassuring words, there was something calculated about his tone. Jiyoung, still confused, began to believe he genuinely cared. Days later, while organizing Minseok's schedule, he noticed her distracted behavior. "You seem preoccupied," he commented in a tone that was dry but carried a hint of concern. Jiyoung tried to brush it off. "I'm fine. Just tired." Minseok didn't press the issue, but gave her a look that seemed to see right through her. Later that same day, while reviewing documents in the conference room, Minseok ran into Jun in the hallway. The encounter started with an exchange of tense glances, but quickly escalated into a heated conversation. "What are you scheming now, Yun?" Minseok asked, his voice low but firm. "Don't worry, Hyung. I'm just enjoying life. Maybe you should try it too." Minseok narrowed his eyes, but Jun walked away before he could say anything else. That night, while reviewing reports in Minseok's office, Jiyoung felt a heavy weight on her chest. Her closeness to Jun was comforting, but something still made her hesitate. Meanwhile, Minseok, sitting in the corner signing documents, observed her in silence. "If you need help, just ask," he said abruptly. Jiyoung looked up, surprised by the unexpected kindness. "I'm fine, thank you." Minseok didn't push further, but his gaze seemed to say more than his words. Jiyoung had no idea that soon, Minseok would be the one to help her face a devastating truth. The days passed, but the weight on Jiyoung's chest only grew heavier. The idea of being pregnant with Jun's child was something she struggled to process, but a persistent feeling that there was more to the story wouldn't leave her alone. Jun continued to appear at opportune moments, offering comfort, but also feeding a quiet sense of distrust. Minseok, on the other hand, started to notice her increasingly frequent absences during lunch breaks, her distracted glances, and the aura of worry she carried. He wasn't the type to get involved in his employees' personal matters, but for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he couldn't ignore what was happening with her. One afternoon, while organizing quarterly reports in Minseok's office, Jiyoung received a message from Jun. "Meet me tonight. We need to talk about the future." She hesitated. As much as she wanted to understand what Jun had in mind, something inside her screamed for caution. She replied affirmatively, but her mind swirled with confusion. Later that day, as she was preparing to leave, Minseok called her back. "Miss Kim, before you go, I need you to review this document. It's urgent." She paused, surprised. She glanced at the clock and realized she was running late for her meeting with Jun, but the authority in Minseok's voice compelled her to sit back down and go over the material with him. During their work, Minseok observed her more closely than usual. He could see the anxiety in her movements, the way her eyes darted to the clock, and decided to ask, "Is something wrong?" Jiyoung swallowed hard, trying to sound natural. "No, just a lot on my mind." Minseok didn't press further, but there was something in his expression that suggested he knew there was more to her answer than she was letting on. Jiyoung eventually managed to leave and met Jun at a discreet restaurant. He seemed more tense than usual, his movements quick, his voice hurried. "We need to act fast, Jiyoung. Things are getting complicated, and I don't want you to get dragged into something bigger than you can handle." "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to keep calm. Jun grabbed her hand across the table, the touch tender yet tinged with urgency. "Let's leave the city. Start over somewhere else. Just you, me, and the baby." "Leave the city? Why?" "Because it'd be easier for us to start fresh, away from complications and certain people." The insinuation wasn't lost on her. Jiyoung felt her heart tighten. "Jun, are you hiding something from me?" His smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Of course not. I just want what's best for you." She tried to smile, but her doubts only grew. In the days that followed, Jiyoung decided she needed answers. The hazy memory of the night Joon had taken her home still nagged at her. Searching for clues, she began discreetly talking to Kang Group employees, trying to piece together more about Joon's past and his relationship with Minseok. One afternoon, while Minseok was in a meeting, Jiyoung took the opportunity to organize older files in the company's system. While browsing a folder labeled Special Projects, she came across strange financial records linked to Joon, revealing significant embezzlement. Her instincts had been right. Joon was using the baby as part of a larger scheme. She didn't have time to process the discovery before she heard Minseok's voice behind her. "What are you doing?" She turned quickly, her heart racing. Minseok stood there, his eyebrows slightly raised, but he wasn't angry. Yet. I was organizing older files, Mr. Kang. Minseok stepped closer, looking at the screen. When he saw what she had opened, his expression darkened. "Where did you find this?" Jiyoung stammered, feeling guilty. It was in the old records folder. Minseok reached over and decisively closed the folder, looking directly at her. "Forget you saw that." But instead of obeying, Jiyoung found her courage. "Mr. Kang, why would your brother be involved in something like this?" He told me he wants me to leave the city with him." Minseok's eyes hardened, and he seemed to deliberate for a moment before responding. "Joon can't be trusted. He's always been reckless, but I don't think he's acting entirely on his own." "What do you mean?" Minseok hesitated but was interrupted by a phone call. He answered quickly but cast one last look at Jiyoung before leaving the room, as if he wanted to say more but couldn't at that moment. That night, alone at home, Jiyoung couldn't sleep. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the full picture still eluded her. Deep down, she knew something bigger was at play. But as she stared at the pregnancy test on her table, another thought consumed her. What if Joon wasn't the baby's father? Her heart sank as she remembered that rainy night at the resort. With Minseok. The next morning, Jiyoung arrived at work with her mind in turmoil. The possibility that Joon might not be the baby's father weighed heavily on her. She didn't know how to approach Minseok with her suspicions, and Joon continued pressuring her, insisting on his plans to leave the city. When she entered the office, Minseok was already there, looking more serious than usual, though not cold. It felt as though he was waiting for something, and Jiyoung sensed it had to do with her. As she organized the day's documents, a message from Joon arrived. "We need to leave tonight. The truth doesn't matter. Trust me." Jiyoung stared at the message, a sinking feeling in her chest. "Is everything all right?" Minseok asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Jiyoung hesitated but replied, "Yes, just a lot to think about lately." Minseok leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "You're not very good at hiding when something's wrong." Jiyoung avoided his gaze, but his penetrating presence made her feel as if he could see right through her. Before she could form a response, Minseok went straight to the point. "Does this have to do with Joon?" The question startled her. She knew she couldn't reveal everything, but she didn't want to lie completely either. "He's being insistent," she said carefully. "That's typical of him. Joon has a special talent for manipulating people. Don't let him fool you." Her heart raced at Minseok's words. There was something in his tone that made her want to trust him, but she still didn't know how far he was willing to go to protect his family. Or himself. That evening, Jiyoung met Joon at a quiet cafe, just as he had requested. He was more anxious than usual, his movements hurried and his expression uneasy. "We need to act fast, Jiyoung. Things are getting more complicated, and I don't want you to be dragged into anything dangerous." "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure. Joon leaned forward, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm but carried a desperate urgency. "Let's leave, just the two of us. We'll start over somewhere far from here, far from Minseok." Jiyoung pulled her hand back slightly, her unease growing. "Why are you in such a hurry? What's really going on, Joon?" His expression flickered, a mix of guilt and frustration. "You have to trust me. I'm doing this for you. For us." But Jiyoung wasn't convinced. The doubt in her heart continued to grow. The following day, Jiyoung decided she needed to confront Minseok. After hours of reflection, she realized she couldn't keep her doubts to herself any longer. When everyone had left for the day, she went to his office. Mr. Kang, can we talk? Minseok looked up from a report, noticing the seriousness in her tone. Go ahead. Jiyoung took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I need to know about that night at the resort. Minseok stayed silent for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. What exactly do you want to know? If something happened between us. He stood up and walked slowly toward her, crossing his arms as he studied her expression. Are you asking me if I'm the father of your baby? The directness of the question made her flinch. Yes, she whispered, barely audible. Minseok let out a long sigh, as if carefully choosing his words. That night, you were upset over a mistake at work. We drank a little, talked, but I would never take advantage of you, Jiyoung. Then, she started, but he interrupted her. But I won't deny that something happened. It was consensual, but we were both not ourselves. Jiyoung felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The confirmation hit her like a lightning bolt, but at the same time, she felt a strange sense of relief. Why didn't you say anything before? Because you seemed sure about Joon, and I didn't want to complicate things further. Minseok took a step closer, his expression softening. But if I'm the father, then I want to take responsibility. His words, filled with sincerity, brought tears to Jiyoung's eyes. She didn't know what to say, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed. It was another message from Joon. The truth doesn't matter. Just trust me. We need to leave tonight. Jiyoung stared at the message, her heart heavy. When she looked up at Minseok, he seemed to read something in her expression. What is it? He asked. Jiyoung hesitated, but knew she couldn't keep anything hidden anymore. Joon wants me to leave with him tonight. Minseok was silent for a moment, but his expression hardened. He's desperate. He must be involved in something serious. I don't know what to do, she whispered, overwhelmed. Minseok placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Trust me. Don't let Joon control you. That night, Jiyoung sat in her small apartment, her mind racing. The revelation from Minseok about the night at the resort had shaken everything she thought she knew. Now, she not only questioned Joon's intentions, but also felt conflicted about Minseok. What had started as a temporary job had turned into an emotional and moral battlefield. She sat on her worn couch, staring at her phone. Joon's latest message was still open on the screen, a shadow lingering over her thoughts. If she left with him, she would be running from her fears and from her responsibility to uncover the truth. But if she stayed, she knew she would face consequences that could change her life forever. The next day, the office felt different. Minseok was more serious than usual, but his focus seemed sharper, almost as if he were waiting for something. Jiyoung could sense his tension, though he said nothing directly. While organizing the day's documents, she suddenly heard the door swing open. It was Joon, arriving without warning, as usual. He moved quickly, his smile strained and his movements more erratic than ever. Hyung, it seems like you've been awfully busy lately. Minseok didn't look up from his work immediately. When he did, his expression was calm but edged with steel. What do you want, Joon? Oh, nothing much. Just thought I'd stop by to say hello to our lovely Miss Kim. Minseok didn't reply, but the air in the room grew heavier. Jiyoung avoided Joon's gaze, feeling trapped between the two brothers. You always think everything revolves around you, don't you? Joon said, breaking the silence. Only when you're involved, Joon, Minseok replied evenly. Joon's smile faltered, and his gaze turned to Jiyoung. So, this is how it's going to be? You're taking his side now? Jiyoung opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Joon didn't wait for an answer and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Later, Minseok called Jiyoung into his office. He leaned against his desk, his face serious but not unkind. I have a proposal. What is it? She asked cautiously. I want you to step away from this. Let me deal with Joon. I'm handing the evidence over to the authorities, but I need you to stay safe. Jiyoung shook her head. I can't just walk away now. I'm in the middle of this, and if something goes wrong... It won't, Minseok interrupted, his voice firm. My job is to make sure it doesn't, but I need you to trust me. His words carried a weight that made Jiyoung pause. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could depend on someone. Still, leaving the fight felt cowardly. She wanted to stand her ground, no matter how afraid she was. "I trust you," she finally said, "but I also want to fight." Minseok nodded slowly, seeing the determination in her eyes. That evening, while organizing some papers at home, Jiyoung received a call from an unknown number. She answered hesitantly, and the voice on the other end made her freeze. "Jiyoung, you need to listen to me." It was Joon. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to sound firm, though her voice trembled slightly. "You don't understand what's at stake. Minseok is lying to you. He only cares about the company and power. You're just a pawn in his game." Jiyoung said nothing, her grip on the phone tightening. "Trust me. Meet me tomorrow night. I'll explain everything." Before she could respond, the line went dead. The next morning, Jiyoung told Minseok about the call. He listened in silence for a moment before speaking. "It's a trap. He knows he's cornered." "I know, but he might say something incriminating if I meet him." "I don't want you taking that risk," Minseok said, but Jiyoung was determined. "If he called me, it's because he thinks he still has control. I want to show him he doesn't." Minseok didn't agree, but he knew Jiyoung wouldn't change her mind. "Then don't go alone. I'll be nearby if anything happens." Jiyoung nodded, feeling a strange sense of comfort in Minseok's presence. The following night, Jiyoung met Joon in a deserted park as planned. He was more anxious than she had ever seen him, his eyes darting around the area as if searching for someone or something. "Why did you want to meet?" Jiyoung asked, crossing her arms to mask her nervousness. "To protect you. Minseok isn't who you think he is. He only cares about the company and his position. You're just a piece in his plan." Jiyoung stared at him, trying to remain impassive. "You say that while trying to use me for your own schemes." Joon laughed bitterly, his voice filled with frustration. "You don't get it, Jiyoung. I was trying to save you. Now everything is falling apart." "Because you caused it," she replied, her voice firm. Joon's face darkened. Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the park. Minseok appeared, flanked by 2 security guards. "It's over, Joon." Rage exploded across Joon's face as he turned to his brother. "You always want to be the hero, don't you? Always the untouchable, the perfect one." "This isn't about me. It's about what you've done and you know it." Joon tried to argue, but the security guards closed in. He knew there was no way out. As Joon was taken away, Jiyoung felt a mix of relief and sadness. Despite everything, she knew he had been consumed by his own ambitions and resentment. Minseok approached her, his expression softening. "It's over now." Jiyoung nodded, but she knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter. She would need strength to face the future. But for the first time in a long while, she felt she wasn't alone anymore. With Joon detained and the evidence handed over to the authorities, the storm seemed to finally begin to subside. Yet Jiyoung still felt the echoes of chaos in her heart and mind. Although the worst seemed to be over, she knew the consequences of the battle would linger for a long time. The morning after the confrontation at the park, Jiyoung entered the office with a mix of relief and uncertainty. The employees were quieter than usual, likely aware of the news about Joon. She tried to keep her head high, but the curious glances and whispers of her colleagues made her uneasy. When she arrived at her desk, she found an email from Minseok. "I need to talk to you. Please come to my office when you're free." Jiyoung took a deep breath. She knew this would be an important conversation. Gathering her courage, she walked to Minseok's office. He was seated behind his desk, but as soon as she entered, he stood and walked toward her. "Sit down," he said, motioning to one of the comfortable chairs nearby. She complied, sensing the tension in the air. Minseok remained standing for a moment, as if organizing his thoughts. "First, I want to apologize," he began. She looked at him, surprised. "For what?" "For involving you in all of this? Even indirectly, you were dragged into problems that were never yours to begin with." "It wasn't your fault," she replied sincerely. "I made my own decisions." Minseok nodded, but there was something in his eyes that showed he still carried guilt. "Even so, I want to make sure you're safe moving forward." "I'll be fine," Jiyoung said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Minseok hesitated for a moment before sitting in the chair beside her, something unusual for him. The closeness made Jiyoung's heart race. About the baby, he began, his voice softer now. I want to be involved, no matter what you decide. His words struck Jiyoung in a way she hadn't expected. For weeks, she had carried the weight of this responsibility alone. Hearing Minseok offer to share that burden made her feel something indescribable. Minseok, I need time to process all of this. He nodded, respectful of her feelings. I understand, but know that I'm not going anywhere. In the days that followed, Jiyoung tried to return to some sense of normalcy. Minseok kept his distance, respecting her space, but she knew he was always there if she needed him. One afternoon, as she reviewed documents, she received an unexpected visit. It was Minseok and Jun's mother, the matriarch of the Kang family. Dressed impeccably, she walked into the office as if she owned the place. Miss Kim Jiyoung, she said, her tone polite but firm. Jiyoung immediately stood, sensing tension. Yes, that's me. The older woman studied her for a moment before continuing. I'd like to speak with you privately. Jiyoung knew she couldn't refuse. The two went to an empty meeting room, and as soon as the door closed, the older woman's demeanor shifted. So it's true? You're expecting my son's child? Jiyoung was taken aback by the directness of the question, but tried to keep her composure. Yes, Mrs. Kang. The matriarch sighed, running a hand over her pearl necklace. My family has already faced enough humiliation because of Jun. I won't allow any more scandals. Jiyoung's heart sank. I'm not asking for anything. I don't want your family's money or approval. Perhaps not now, the older woman said, her eyes sharp. But what you want is irrelevant. What matters is protecting the Kang family legacy. Jiyoung opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the door opened. Minseok stood there, his expression serious and commanding. Mother, this isn't your business. The matriarch turned to him, surprised. Minseok, you think you can handle this on your own? This is about our family's reputation. This is about my life, and you will not interfere. Jiyoung was speechless, watching the confrontation unfold. If you can't respect the choices I make, Minseok continued, his voice firm, then maybe it's best for you to stay out of it entirely. His mother stared at him for a moment but said nothing more. She simply turned and left, her silence more piercing than any words. Minseok turned back to Jiyoung, his expression softening. I'm sorry about that. She shook her head, still processing what had just happened. Thank you for standing up for me. A rare smile appeared on his face. I told you, I'll protect you, and I keep my promises. That night, alone in her apartment, Jiyoung reflected on everything that had happened. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't facing the world alone. Despite all the chaos, there was something about Minseok that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find a different future for herself and her baby. With Jun detained and the evidence fully handed over to the authorities, the worst seemed to be over. Yet Jiyoung knew the echoes of the chaos would linger, shaping her decisions for the future. The morning after the confrontation, Jiyoung entered the office with mixed emotions. The employees whispered quietly, their usual chatter subdued. Everyone seemed aware of what had happened, but no one dared to say anything directly. Minseok's email had been the first thing she saw when she arrived. We need to talk. Please come to my office. Jiyoung took a deep breath, knowing that this conversation would shape whatever lay ahead. She walked to his office and knocked gently before stepping inside. Minseok was seated at his desk, but as soon as he saw her, he stood up and gestured for her to sit in one of the chairs near the window. Thank you for coming, he began, his voice calm but tinged with a rare vulnerability. What is it? Jiyoung asked softly, still unsure of his tone. Minseok hesitated for a moment, then spoke. I wanted to thank you and apologize. Jiyoung blinked in surprise. Apologize? For what? For everything you've been through because of me, because of Jun, because of this family. You were dragged into something you didn't ask for. It wasn't your fault, Jiyoung replied firmly. I made my own choices. Minseok gave a small nod, but his eyes betrayed the weight of his guilt. Even so, I should have protected you better. And I want to make it clear that moving forward, I will. His sincerity caught Jiyoung off guard. For weeks she had carried everything alone. Now hearing his words felt like a small but vital relief. About the baby, he continued, his voice softer. I don't know how you feel about me, but I want you to know that I'll be here. No matter what. Jiyoung looked at him, her emotions swirling. Minseok, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm still processing everything. I understand, he said. Take your time, but I'm not going anywhere. In the days that followed, Jiyoung began to find a rhythm again, though the whispers and stares at work didn't entirely fade. Minseok kept his distance, allowing her the space she needed, but she knew he was quietly watching, ready to step in if necessary. One afternoon, Jiyoung received an unexpected visitor, Minseok and Joon's mother. The Kang matriarch entered the office with her usual air of authority, impeccably dressed and carrying herself with sharp precision. Miss Kim, she said, her tone polite but frosty. Jiyoung stood up quickly, unsure of how to respond. Mrs. Kang. I'd like a word with you. Privately. Jiyoung's stomach tightened, but she nodded and followed the older woman to a meeting room. Once the door closed, the older woman turned, her expression unreadable but firm. So, it's true? You're having my son's child? Jiyoung felt her breath catch, but she forced herself to meet the matriarch's gaze. Yes, it's true. Mrs. Kang's lips pressed into a thin line as she clasped her hands in front of her. This family has already endured enough humiliation because of Joon. I will not allow further scandal. Jiyoung felt her fists clench, but she kept her voice steady. I'm not asking for anything from your family. Not money, not approval. Perhaps not now, Mrs. Kang said coldly. But intentions can change, and regardless of what you say, my family's legacy must be protected. Before Jiyoung could respond, the door opened abruptly, and Minseok walked in. Mother, he said sharply, his voice cold. This isn't your place. Mrs. Kang turned, startled. Minseok, I am your mother. This is my family, my business. No, it's mine, Minseok replied, stepping forward. His tone softened, but his resolve was unwavering. And if you can't respect the decisions I make, then maybe it's best you stay out of them. Mrs. Kang stared at her son for a long moment before walking past him without another word, her silence more cutting than any argument. Minseok sighed deeply and turned to Jiyoung. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Thank you for standing up for me, Jiyoung said, her voice soft but grateful. Minseok gave a faint smile, a rare warmth in his expression. I told you I'd protect you, and I meant it. That night, Jiyoung sat alone in her apartment, reflecting on the whirlwind of the past few months. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't facing the world entirely on her own. Despite the chaos, Minseok's words and actions gave her hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a future worth fighting for her and for her baby. But she knew the road ahead would not be easy. The Kang family's influence loomed large, and navigating her connection to them would take more strength than she had ever imagined.